Chapter 14, Principles of Disease and Epidemiology. So to introduce some terms here, you see the term pathogens, which are disease-causing microorganisms. So these could be things like bacteria, viruses. Not all microorganisms cause disease, so the ones that do, we term them as pathogens. The way they do this is they must have some kind of property that allows them to get into the human body or to produce toxins that if someone would get into the body or touch, in some cases that they would cause the pathogen to overcome the body. And so when they actually overcome the body's defenses, that's when we really call it disease. And so someone could have an infection without a disease, but once it really causes damage somewhere in the body, then we would term it disease. So when we study pathology, pathology has kind of three major areas that it's concerned with, and the first one is etiology. Etiology is what we want to look at when we're trying to find the cause of the disease, and ideally we end up coming up with something very specific. And so, there's a lot of different things out there, but if it was bacteria or something, then we would have a genus and species name ideally. To see that, not just, oh, someone got sick from eating chicken. Well, what was actually in the chicken? Maybe it was some type of salmonella bacteria. We would want to get as specific as we can. Another category here, pathogenesis. What does this pathogen actually do to the body? What are the steps that kind of happen in the body that lead up to disease actually occurring? And then, how does the pathogen actually sort of get past some of our host defenses? And then as a result, in the host, in the structures, what happens to the tissues and the cells or wherever this pathogen has invaded. So all of these aspects need to be looked at. Just like a pathologist would be looking maybe at a cell culture and looking to identify anything that didn't look to be within the ordinary ranges and may notice that there was a change from disease. And so like I kind of just said, we need to determine infection versus disease. And so the pathogenic microorganisms could be within a host, but if they're not causing any ill effects on that host, then that host would not technically be considered to have the disease. But of course, this infection could be passed on to other people from one person to another person, and then that other person may end up getting a disease as a result as well. So just having an infection is kind of worrisome because oftentimes that person may not know unless they're actively looking for it. In this chapter you'll find there's a lot of terms that you kind of need to compare, so just make sure that you sort of understand the differences between those terms in order to be successful with really trying to kind of understand how they all relate to microbiology and disease. And so we've talked before about normal microbiota or normal flora, and so just to kind of review that a little bit, when a baby is in utero, there actually are no microbes that are involved, or they're not supposed to be anyway, but at birth, usually if it's a vaginal birth, then the first bacteria that someone would be exposed to would be lactobacilli, and then there are several others that they would be exposed to as well. And you can see some pictures here, some different types of species. These are commonly found in different areas in the body, and again, these are part of our normal flora. So generally, they're not pathogenic. There are times when they can, end up in the wrong place and become pathogenic, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. And so over time, your normal microbiota, your normal flora increases. Everybody's is going to be a little bit different. And sometimes there can be transient flora, which means that it comes and goes depending kind of on situations as well. And so it's kind of an ever-changing cast of characters at any given time. But what we want to kind of realize is that if we were never exposed to anything, then we would never be able to, have any kind of defense. And so it's really important that we do have kind of a good amount and combination of normal flora. So when it comes to the human body has at least 10 trillion cells, and the estimate is that for every cell in the human body, there's at least 10 times that many bacteria. And so it sounds kind of frightening, but in general, most of these bacteria are good, they're working for us, they're helping protect us, they're probably getting some kind of a benefit by living in our cells and around our cells as well. But it just kind of goes to show you that there's a lot of microbes that we can look at and kind of think about. So again, just kind of a picture here of some of the normal flora that we might see. And so there's a picture of some tissues in the nose, in the stomach, and in the small intestine, so different types of bacteria that live there. In 2007, we've talked before about the Human Genome Project. The Human Microbiome Project was started, and that's kind of mapping out what different people would have in their microbiome, in their different areas, what kinds of combinations of different species and levels of different types of bacteria, along with fungi and other things as well. And so it's kind of an interesting project. You can always kind of look that up. It's sort of an ongoing thing as well. But nowadays, a lot of people are getting their microbiome tested to kind of see, what their makeup is, and a lot of times they can, adjust or take prebiotics or probiotics in order to kind of adjust the normal flora if there's some issues going on. A lot of digestive disorders. I just had a friend who was talking about his son was having some issues with ADHD, and they had his flora tested, and after some changes in his diet, they saw a big difference. So it's kind of an up-and-coming field and pretty interesting. And so when it comes to the flora, like I said, it's going to be different for different people. And I've, read statistics before that there's possibly, 800 different species of bacteria just in your mouth alone. So of course, everybody's going to be a lot different. But these kind of list some factors here that may play a role in how the flora is distributed, where it's found, and then what is the composition of where it's actually found as well. And so you can see here nutrients, physical factors, host defenses. If someone has a stronger immune system or a weaker immune system, there may be some changes there. And then mechanical factors as well. And so just by the process of urination or food moving through the gut, cilia, moving things through the respiratory tract, chewing, things like that, saliva in the mouth. These are things that kind of adjust, what is actually going to maybe stay in the body or get in the body in the first place. And so just kind of realizing there's a lot of factors that go into it is key. And so when we look at a relationship between our normal flora and the host, there's going to be some antagonism going on there. And so basically what this means is that the flora wants to be there. So species that are living in us and on us, they're going to try to kind of maintain their territory. And so they're going to provide some competition. And if they can provide competition to harmful organisms, that's good for us. Because if something comes along that's bad for us, then they will compete to stay there and possibly not let something else grow, or at least not let it get too out of control. And so the reason they do this is because they're both competing for nutrients. Every cell needs to eat. And then also sometimes there are other proteins, factors that are produced that would inhibit growth of something else. And so again, kind of seeking out their territory and laying their claim to the area. And then there's also actual receptors where sometimes things like bacteria can occupy those receptors, and if the receptors are occupied by something, something else can't come in and take its place. Or maybe it could, but usually if it's occupied, it's not going to get knocked out. And so again, they kind of want to make sure that they are there to stay as well. So they really are our partners if you think about it like that. So this term symbiosis comes up, and symbiosis to me always seems like, oh, it's always a happy situation, a little on the kumbaya side. But basically what it means is we're just looking at a relationship between at least two organisms. And so this is where we can break it down into three different types. So first of all, there's commensalism. And so in commensalism, you have one species that benefits and the other really doesn't have any disadvantage. No advantage, but also a disadvantage. In mutualism, then there's a benefit of both. And so something like, regular E. coli, not pathogenic kind, living in our intestine, and it's living in our intestine, it's getting a nice little food supply there. Meanwhile, it's for the benefit that we are getting is it's maybe, hindering other pathogens from taking up residence there. But also sometimes there can be things in its life cycle that it gives to us, like E. coli can produce vitamin K for us, which is kind of nice. And then there's parasitism. So when we talk about disease, one of the species is then harmed and has some kind of effect a negative effect as well. And so, something benefits if it gets to live there and stay there and multiply. That's a benefit in that case, especially in the case of disease. And so this kind of summarizes those three concepts as well. And again, as long as you understand these are all types of symbiosis and understand the differences between them, they're not too bad to kind of process. Lots of examples, but as long as you understand the difference, that's kind of key. Interesting to read about too. And so then we come to opportunistic microorganisms. And so these are things that maybe they're living in a normal environment, maybe they're living on your skin. But maybe instead they get into the bloodstream. That can become a problem, or they can get into the respiratory tract. And so something like strep pneumoniae here can be kind of innocuous, but then if it does get into the lungs, it can cause pneumonia. Other things here, a lot of times, things that do get to the lungs cause issues as well. And so Neisseria meningitidis is kind of a normal part of our flora. But if it gets in kind of past the blood-brain barrier, it can cause meningitis, and so that can be an issue as well. And so it may not produce disease in someone who's, healthy as well, or it could, but if somebody's immunocompromised or somebody, has surgery and they have an open wound, a lot of times things will find their way in there. So that's why we call them opportunistic. So this takes us to the etiology of infectious disease, and like I said, etiology is the cause, and we want to look very specifically at what is the cause, and we want to try to get it down to kind of a common species name as well. At this point, I'm going to leave off here because I think the next few slides are going to take me longer than my allotted 15 minutes, so I'll see you on the flip side.